Welcome to the Diverse Minds podcast, where we give you the tips, tools, and techniques you need to be a mentally healthy and inclusive leader. Each week, you'll hear about a variety of topics linked to mental health, wellbeing, and diversity that will enhance both your professional practice and personal wellbeing. Welcome to the 90th episode of the award-winning Diverse Minds podcast. And in today's episode, I'm going to be talking about what's next for wellbeing as we transition or try to transition from life in a pandemic. I think it's fair to say that most of us have experienced a roller coaster ride and ups and downs with our mental health. In essence, the way in which we have managed our psychological and emotional wellbeing. The way that we've thought about and felt and acted differently over the last 14 months, how we've handled stress, related to others and made choices. Perhaps our self-esteem has fluctuated in addition to how we've seen others. And our mental health has been a key part in the way in which we've formed, sustained, and managed relationships during lockdown. So I wanted to spend some time talking about how our mental health and well-being, or what's next, are going to be impacted as we transition, because I think this is going to be a key question on employers' lips and also employees' lips into how they're going to be supported back to the workplace, or indeed if they are going to go back to the workplace at all. I know some people have been overjoyed about home working, and for other people it's been a really mixed feeling. I think it's important to say that well-being isn't something that you have or you don't have, that well-being incorporates physical and mental health to create an overall picture of being well. And it's how you manage your day-to-day life and how you're feeling on a given day. And if you listen to this podcast, you'll know how I always talk about the fact that it's unlikely that we all wake up perfectly mentally optimum every single day. So mental well-being is how we manage ourselves, our relationships, as I mentioned previously, and participate in life in the way we want to. And of course, well-being is influenced by the environment we work in, and as a result is likely to change, which of course many of us will have felt acutely over this last 14 months. Now, of course, there's skills and behaviors that we can all adopt to improve our overall well-being, and this helps manage our stress levels and also develop our resilience. Now, flourishing means a lot more than the absence of stress or mental ill health, although, of course, the absence of stress is hugely positive. It's about having that energy, passion, self-esteem, improved physical health, supportive relationships, and being successful in all of our endeavors. And I also wanted to mention research by Rathenharter in 2010, which highlights the 5 different types of well-being categories. So yes, there's overall well-being, but we can also have well-being in different parts of our life. So firstly, career well-being. That's how you occupy your time or simply enjoy what you do every day. So it doesn't have to be a traditional kind of career, but it's really important to think about how you're spending your time and does it bring you joy and purpose. The second one is social well-being, so having strong relationships and love in your life. And when I say love, I don't just mean heteronormative romantic relationships. This can be love for friends, love for your garden, love for your pets, love for your family members, love in the broadest sense. And then financial well-being, which is effectively managing your economic life, having enough money to pay for the things you need to, and having money to spend on things that bring you enjoyment. Physical well-being, having good health and enough energy to get things done on a daily basis. Now, this doesn't mean that if you have fluctuating health or a long-term health condition that you can't have physical well-being. It's how you manage that and how you have the support to do that. And then finally, community well-being, the sense of engagement you have within the area you live in. And of course, many people have made changes. They've moved to get that community or to say, you know what, I'm not commuting anymore and I can build a community where I know my neighbours. So all of these things are super important. And of course, they form the pillars of well-being. And you could have 4 out of 5, but if one area is really dragging you down, then that overall well-being is going to be hard to achieve. I also wanted to touch on emotional well-being at work because this is crucial and something that clients and my coachees like to talk about. So emotional well-being is also could be part of this umbrella of well-being. It's not about the absence of emotions, but the ability to understand the value of those emotions and harness them positively in the workplace, and also to support others with their emotional well-being journey. Everyday emotional well-being involves identifying, building upon, and operating from one's strength, rather than fixating on problems or weaknesses. Now, that's not to say we ignore that completely, and it's not to say that we have areas that we want to improve in, but it's thinking about how we can understand our strengths to enable us to build upon things that we want to do in the future. And the more equipped we are to understand emotions, the greater our capacity to cope with stress and focus on important priorities. But of course, emotional well-being will vary from culture to culture, and that's something we need to think about. And our emotional well-being has been pushed to the limit as there's been little separation between what is professional and what's personal. And perhaps you've had your own challenges. Maybe it's been homeschooling, maybe it's been constantly working, maybe it's been not being able to see people, to travel, to live life in the way that you want to. But it's highly unlikely that any of us have really found this plain sailing. And then we can also overlay resilience on top of this. And as you know, I talk about resilience being a rubber band. And we each have a rubber band that needs to be a particular size, shape, and color to function optimally. When I talk about resilience, I mean the fact that it's the capacity to positively respond to and cope with difficult situations, events, or setbacks. It's sometimes referred to as bounce back ability. But I want to be really clear and say that resilience isn't about sucking it up, a stiff upper lip, and putting up with nonsense or negative bullying behaviors. Resilience is more about, well, how do I want to cope with this? What choices do I have? Who could I go to for support? And where do I draw the line? So going back to our rubber band, we each have a rubber band that needs to be a particular size, shape, and color for us to be able to exercise this bounce back ability. And when something difficult happens, our rubber band gets pulled out of kilter, either shape, maybe it changes color, and it's not the way we need it to be. And in order to get it back, there are things we have to do to bring our rubber band back to that optimum shape, size, and color. And we each have our own techniques and ways of doing this. Resilience isn't about avoiding life's challenges by pretending they're not there or ignoring them, but noticing when that pressure appears and when we're in a sticky situation or things are becoming hard, and taking proactive steps to manage those pressures. So it incorporates sustainability and thus provides lasting benefits for our emotional health. And it's really key that resilience applies to individuals, but it also applies to teams, organizations, and countries. And we've seen that certain countries have been far more resilient than others when managing the pandemic. So I wanted to just talk a little bit about wellbeing initiatives in the UK pre-pandemic, things that I've seen across all sectors. And I wanted to talk about this because in order to understand what transitioning is going to look like, we need to understand where we were before lockdown. So I'm talking about maybe January, February, and some of March 2020. The kinds of things that we'd see in workplaces were on-site gyms and also fitness apps for staff to use, employee assistance programs, which unfortunately are very underutilized in many cases, peer buddying schemes, so when new staff members start, to help them get used to the particular organization, buddying schemes, mental health first aid training so that organizations had the full mental health first aiders. They may have also had mental health first aid champions that do the one-day course, and people who are mental health first aid aware who do the half-day course. Initiatives like Reclaim Your Lunch Break, which for some people I know sounds ridiculous. And I also am aware in some countries that's absolutely obscene because everyone takes lunch breaks and this isn't a thing. Well, in the UK, we were getting very accustomed to, and I don't think home working's really helped, but having lunch at our desks and not really taking a proper break. There was a lot of talk, wasn't there, about flexible working. So anyone has the right from 2014 to request flexible working. That doesn't mean you'll necessarily get it, but anyone has the right to do that. Agile working, which is working from any location as long as you get the work done. Meeting free days, so things like Focus Fridays, technology free days where you had to go and see people at their desks, options to purchase private medical care, particularly in the private sector, and fruit bowls in the office, which is lovely, but how does it really create systemic change? Nevertheless, we have to mention this because it was what was happening. So now with the transition and the potential to go back, and who knows, it will be going back permanently, temporarily, blended approach. Each organization will take their own stance on it. Recently, there have been some really interesting pieces around how this is going to look. And the government has set up a task force to look at flexible working, trying to balance flexible working with, of course, the fact that businesses in town centres, if people don't go back to city centre locations, will suffer, and balancing that. And I think one of the positive things, though, is that for many of my colleagues who have disabilities, they found this brilliant for them to work in a really useful way, particularly my colleagues with mobility impairments who are wheelchair users who couldn't access buildings because things just weren't accessible, who couldn't travel very freely because our public transport is not particularly accessible. For many visually impaired colleagues, I know it's been a challenge for colleagues who are part of the deaf hearing loss community. So it's not been perfect, but I also know that there is that flexibility and also that productivity has gone up. So this whole thing about, oh, you can't work from home, many of my friends, many people that I supported in the workplace were always told you can't work from home because you're not going to be productive. What have we found? They found that productivity has actually gone up. Worst case scenario stayed the same. So in fact, there's no reason for people to have to go into the office, although I totally understand that many people want to. They want a demarcation. People use their commute time in ways that works for them to read a book or to have that space to listen to a podcast. So we have to think about this holistically, and it's going to be interesting to see what this task force says. But I think things that really need to be considered as a result of COVID-19 is firstly that 25 years worth of gender equity has been wiped out in a matter of months. And the UN talked about that. So there's a lot of work to be done there. There's a lot of reparations in a sense, and also the fact that this needs to be at the forefront. Of course, we've seen race, ethnicity, and nationality discrepancies, the fact that global majority staff have to educate their peers about racism, which has been really exhausting. And then you add a layer of video call onto that, and it's very difficult. I don't think we are ready for what's been talked about a little bit, but we don't know the full extent of it, of people experiencing long COVID and effectively being disabled by their experience of COVID. Financial inequity, digital poverty, we've talked about, the changing use of space in offices. I know many offices in city centre locations are being converted into housing. However, that's not accessible, affordable housing. But also if offices aren't changing, the space has to be used differently and social distancing has to be put in place. And now I understand as well, there might be a lot of vaccine hesitancy for some people. So not anti-vax stance, but vaccine hesitancy. And how is that going to be managed in terms of vaccine passports, if they're going to come in, but even local vaccine policies for workplaces and who can come in and out as a result. The huge pressure that there's been on the hospitality and arts sector. We talk about it all the time on the podcast, but the increasing prevalence of mental ill health and lack of systemic support. And I think for many of us who might not have experienced diagnosed mental ill health, and I'll speak for myself, but our mental health hasn't always been great. And even though we're doing all the tips and techniques, we're getting all the information, it can be incredibly difficult. And sometimes there aren't easy solutions, but what about that systemic support? I think also thinking about grief and the need to speak about death in the workplace. And again, for some cultures, this is going to be first nature. We speak about death quite openly. But I think the Victoriana culture is still very present in the UK in terms of death and not talking about it. So that discrepancy with people who might want to talk about it, remember loved ones that have passed away, compared with those who can't bear to talk about it, don't want to talk about it, feel very uncomfortable talking about death. Again, people who have been on and off furlough and how that's impacted them, and whether they will come back 80%, 60%, 20%, how that could impact their well-being positively and negatively. Ergonomic issues, back pains from working in non-ergonomic environments. I know many people, you've been sitting at your kitchen tables trying to work and do things, and that's been really difficult. So what's that going to look like? And thinking about if people do continue to work from home, how are employers going to make that environment safe? Commuting on public transport and people's anxiety levels, and also ways in which we want to connect now. Potentially we don't want to be as social, perhaps due to fear of COVID and getting used to socializing at a distance. Many of us, including myself, have really lost a bit of joie de vivre, and we don't necessarily want to see people in the same way that we are used to doing. So given that I've just framed that, and it might seem like a huge long list of things, what's next for wellbeing as the transition happens, as it happens across countries? Also, we're not siloed. Countries work together. Workplaces have offices in different areas. So I think one of the first things is to think about the country and the culture is very dependent on the country and the culture, and how different countries will approach this differently from a governmental perspective, from a workplace perspective, and what that transition looks like. Approaches to hygiene, approaches to distancing, all of that's going to play a picture. I think there needs to be more research on the impacts of COVID through an intersectional lens. So we know that there's been gender inequity, but do we know gender inequity by social status? Do we know gender inequity issues on a racial lens, a caring lens, a disability lens? So thinking about that, there needs to be more done on that and more to educate and inform. I think we all have to accept that it's going to be uncomfortable. So, whether we make the decision to go back to the office and we decide to commute, there might be discomfort there. When we get to the office, how the desks are positioned, they're probably not going to be as close like they used to. Will there be shifts to go into the kitchen? Will there be a colleague that really wants to talk to you about a family member that's passed away and that's not your framework or not something that you're used to doing? So there are going to be lots of discomfort and thinking about, well, how do I be okay with this discomfort? I also think positively that flexible and agile working, so flexible working in terms of hours and agile working in terms of working wherever you need to get the job done, are going to be more standard. So I think that will be one positive thing to come out of this. Hopefully, we'll also see more of a 4-day work week. I know countries are trialing this, so New Zealand, Spain, and I think it would be wonderful if we could trial it here because it has been shown to be much better for our well-being and our mental health. I mentioned ergonomic equipment and employers making sure that there is the right health and safety standards for people working at home. I also am a very strong proponent and believer of psychological risk assessments as part of this process. So it's not only is it about the ergonomics and the physical side, but also the psychological risk assessment in terms of how people will be able to connect with colleagues. Will they have the interaction they want to? Will they be going into the office once every 2 weeks? And who will they be able to connect with? And then digital support and therapy for bereavement. So I mentioned this in my first podcast, my predictions for 2021 workplace wellbeing. So do check out that episode. But digital support and therapy for bereavement with specific cultural elements, going back to the fact that different cultures will grieve differently. People from different cultural backgrounds will need different sorts of support. And given that we're working more remotely and therapists also would probably want flexible and agile working, that digital support is going to be key. So it doesn't have to be that one-to-one connection face to face, but it could also be apps, it could be text messages, and that flexibility around therapies available. I think a crucial thing as well is training for managers. And I also mentioned this in my predictions for workplace wellbeing, but it's become to the forefront more and more that training for managers to spot signs of mental ill health remotely and having those conversations remotely. It is trickier, it is more difficult, but there are still ways to do it, and how it might look differently. So if you're interested in finding out more and want to work with me, this is something I've been doing over the last 14 months, and I'd love to hear from you. If you feel you're struggling as an organization or a manager to talk about mental ill health in a remote virtual way, then please do get in contact with me. You can email Layla, that's Leyla, at diverseminds.co.uk. Mentioning poverty and digital poverty, financial wellbeing support is going to be essential, including debt management. And I think, again, talking about this and making it more open and not so stigmatized as part of the workplace is going to be crucial to help people. I also know that some people have managed to save a lot of money. There are lots of articles about how many billions the UK has saved. But of course, that's not going to be everyone's experience. And we also don't know someone's debt profile from before the pandemic. And it might be that they've been the main breadwinner, and then a partner has had to go back to work and they've tried and they've been on furlough. Maybe they've had another child and that's put more strain on. So I think that's going to need to be really important. And it's definitely on the transition list for me. Going back to that point about resilience isn't just about individuals. How is that resilience going to be built at an organizational and individual level? Organizations really do need to think about the shape and size of their rubber band and what they need to do to get it into the right place. And then work-life balance, that's going to be ongoing. It's going to look slightly different to support the demarcation between home and life. And don't forget to check out my Mentally Healthy Professional online course, 4 modules for incredibly busy people who don't have time to think about work-life balance, to have a look at their work-life balance profile in 4 simple stages at a cost of £57. So do have a look at that, and there's a link in the show notes. I think there's also going to be need for more clarity and communication, so as certain an environment as possible for staff. We can't always be clear, we can't always provide clarity, but this is going to be really important in terms of communication. If there are redundancies, if there are sort of furloughs between now and September, or any changes that need to be made, it's very important to do this ethically and clearly. Redundancy support and flexibility in career trajectory too. So if redundancies do have to be made, what is the support available? And it's not simply telling someone they're no longer valid. Now, I know, of course, legally it's unlikely that anyone would do that, but often the way redundancies are communicated are not great. And also thinking about flexibility in career trajectory. So maybe someone wants to retrain and they want to have a second career as a graphic designer, that organizations need to be open to that and not have certain expectations around age and life stage and where people should be. We really do have a lot of mindset work to be done around that. So doing things differently might mean that it is going back to the beginning and starting again. There will be challenges in renegotiating boundaries, power, what it looks like, and setting boundaries for ourselves and with others. I think it's also vital to remember that we don't have control over everything, but remembering what we can and do have control of and how we want to have those conversations. And also, everyone will have a different experience and triggers related to the pandemic, and that's not going to look the same. And how do you have time and space to make room in the workplace to discuss that? And I think for some individuals and organizations, there's a desperate need to get back to normal, quote unquote, but our normal has changed. And there are countries who've done this super successfully because of their COVID-19 strategy was proactive and one of elimination rather than containment. And there is uncertainty in the future. And even with excellent scientific modeling, it's not 100% crystal clear. We have news about variants and strains, and it is going to be ongoing. So it's imperative to be aware of the impact of changes to wellbeing on ourselves and others as managers, leaders, friends, and family members. And adaptability and integration are so vital, as we see in nature. We are part of this big ecosystem, and we should remember that. So I really hope this has been a useful episode to you. Please do get in touch with me if you want to know more about the support for workplaces on wellbeing and transition, race equality, and as an individual, if you're interested in coaching. And don't forget to check out the Mentally Healthy Professional online course, 4 simple modules to help you with your work-life balance. So take care, everyone, and I'll see you in the next episode.
Thanks for listening to the Diverse Minds podcast. Don't forget to subscribe on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, or wherever you access your podcasts from. You can also connect with me on Facebook, Twitter, and LinkedIn. Tune into next week's episode of the podcast, where I'll bring you more insights on mental health and inclusion. Bye for now.